Okay, we're on DAF Lamed Aleph, Amid Aleph, Rabbi in the Mishnah. It'll be a shorter DAF today. We're finishing off the parak where the entire theme of the parak is about the principle of chazaka, right? Where we assume that the state that we left something continues to be that state until we are informed otherwise. And we can conduct ourselves halachically based on what the assumption of that state is, if it's the way that we left it. So, in the same vein, hameniach peros lios mafrish alehen truma umaisros, or maos lios mafrish alehen maiser sheni, mafrish alehen becheska shehin kayomin. The Mishnah tells us, let's say I have a warehouse that's adjacent to my farm, and in that warehouse I keep some grain that I've set aside for the purpose of using as my truma or my meiser, so that when I harvest new grain, instead of having to separate from the new grain, I'll simply designate the grain in the warehouse as being the truma or the meiser. The question is, do I have to check the warehouse before I make the declaration and declare it to be truma and meiser? So the Mishnah says no. You can assume the way you left it yesterday or 2 days ago or a week ago, the grain is still there. Or let's say you put money in a drawer or in a safe place of safekeeping, and you said, I'm going to use that money to be poida meiser sheni, so that the meiser sheni, the produce itself, will not have to be taken up to Yerushalayim, but the money will be the pidyon, will be the exchange. So do you have to check to make sure the money's there? No, you left it there, so you can assume it's still there. That's the principle of chazaka, right? But now the Mishnah says, Im avdu harei choshesh me'es la'es divrei Rabbi El-Azar. However, says the Mishnah, if, however, you later on go back and check the warehouse, or you check the safekeeping place, and you see that the grain or the money is missing, so then you got a problem. So how far back do you have to assume that the money was missing or the produce was missing? Right. Me'es la'es, which literally means 24 hours, but that's a little bit vague. We're going to clarify the ambiguity of that statement in the Gemara shortly. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Bishlosha prakim bodkin es hayayin. Rabbi Yehuda now tells us that in general, if you want to use wine that's in a warehouse or a storage area and use that as your tithing wine, so then you have to check the wine 3 times a year, because there are 3 times a year that wine is subject to spoilage. And what it means is that there are 3 intervals where up until that time the wine could be spoiled. So check immediately after those spoilage periods to make sure that the wine is still good. So what are those 3 times? B'kidom shel motzoi achag. Kidom is literally a breeze or a wind that blows right after Sukkos. So check the wine immediately after Sukkos when the wind is blowing to make sure that during the late summer period the wine has not spoiled.
Is that an Eastern wind?
We're going to talk about the east in a minute, but yes, it comes from the word kadim, which is an eastern wind, and the Gemara is going to talk about east winds in a moment. The second time is when the grapes are just now budding to grow, which is in the early part of the, or late part of the winter, early part of the spring. And that's also a time when you want to check that the wine hasn't spoiled over the winter. Uvishas kanisas mayim bebosar. And also the third time you want to check is also sometime in the spring or early summer season when the grapes are just now beginning to turn into bosar, which is immature grapes, and it's called when the water enters into the bosar, meaning when the juice starts to become tangible within the grape. It's not a mature grape yet, but it's large enough that it has a juiciness in it. That's one explanation. Rashi says another explanation of Mishas Kanisas Mayim Babosar is that they would harvest grapes in an immature state, crush them and mix them with water in order to manufacture vinegar. But that's not the harvest season, that's the pre-harvest season. That's also a time to check the wine in the storehouses to make sure that it's still okay. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Mai me es la'es. What does it mean that if you discover the grain or the money missing, that you can assume that everything's okay from 24 hours back. So Rabbi Yochanan Omer me'es la'es shel bedika. So Rabbi Yochanan learns the simple pshat is that if you go today is Thursday, today's Wednesday. If you go on Wednesday and you discover that the money's missing, then you can assume that the money was there, but the money was missing 24 hours before. But you don't have to be choshesh that the money was missing further back than 24 hours. Okay, so therefore, let's say I tithed on Monday and today's Wednesday, I'm okay. But if I tithed yesterday, based upon my reliance on this money, and then I discovered on Wednesday that it's not here, then I have to be choshesh that maybe since that was within the last 24 hours, then maybe the money was also missing, so then I have to retithe, and I'm in trouble. Rabbi Elazar ben Antignos Omer Mishum Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yanai me'es la'es shel hanacha. He says no. He's much more machmir. He says, when was the last time you checked that the money was there? So from that last time that you checked the money was there, go 24 hours forward from that time, and until then you can assume the money was there. Past that time, you have to be choshesh the money was missing. So let's say the last time I checked was 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago I checked, the money was in the drawer. So if any time I tithed in the last 13 days, so then I'm in trouble. But if I tithed a half a day after I had checked, since that's within me'es la'es from the last time I checked, I'm okay. So you see that there's a difference of opinion that's pretty dramatic, has pretty dramatic repercussions. Do you assume the chazaka that the money was intact only up until the last 24 hours that now I discover it's missing? Or do you assume that the money was only intact for 24 hours after I last saw that it was there? That's a big difference in halacha. Now, Bishlama, so now the Gemara says like this. Let's look at the language of our Mishnah. Bishlama laman da'omer me'es la'es shel bedika shapir. If the Mishnah says, like Rabbi Yochanan had said, that you can be more lenient and you can say that if you discover today that it's missing, then you have to be choshish it was missing only in the last 24 hours. So then the language of the Mishnah works well because it says, Hareza choshesh me'es la'es. The word me means going back 24 hours, that you have to worry that it was missing. However, elalaman da'omer me'es la'es shel hanacha hay me'es la'es ad me'es la'es mi boyele. But if you're going to say that it's not that you have to be choshesh only in the last 24 hours, but you have to be choshesh all the way back until 24 hours after the last time you checked, so then it should have said ad me'es la'es, until the 24-hour buffer after the time you checked, not from. Mm-hmm. And so the preposition is wrong, according to the second opinion, and the Gemara says, you're right, it's a kasha. Okay, Divrei Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar was the one who said that you have this 24-hour period, that you can assume that the wine was there. Whether you learn like the first opinion or the second opinion, he still says that you can rely at least on a 24-hour window that the wine was still intact. You have a chazaka that you can rely on. Either it's only 24 hours after the time you checked, or it's up until the 24 hours since now that you discover it's missing. But the point is that there is a reliance on a chazaka that the wine was still intact, or the money or the grain was still intact, even though now I discovered that it's missing. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Chalukan alav Faivel Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar the Amora, that's Rabbi Elazar ben Pidas, by the way, says that Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua the Tana, his colleagues disagreed with him. And they held that if today you discover that the money's missing, then all bets are off. There's no longer a chazaka at all that you can rely on, not even for 24 hours. Once you discover that the money is missing, then you have to assume, you have to be choshesh, that the second, 2 weeks ago, after the last time you checked, second later, the money is gone. So in other words, and there's a lot of Talmudic discussion, there's a whole sefer called Shav Shemaitza. You may have heard of that sefer. It goes through all the different permutations of when you have conflicting chazakas. This is a classic case of conflicting chazakas. We've got a chazaka demi ikara, which means we have a chazaka of what we knew what the state was, and now we have a chazaka dahashta. We now have a chazaka of what the state is now. They're clashing. So Rebbe Elazar in the Mishnah says, okay, compromise between the two. 24 hours, right? But according to the Chachamim that we're being introduced to now, the Chazaka de Hashda, the current situation where the money is gone, completely overrides the Chazaka de Mi'ikara, and therefore we assume that immediately after you checked the money last time 2 weeks ago and the money was there, immediately after the money's gone. And therefore anything that you tithed since the last time you checked is considered to be not legitimately tithed. And how do we know this? Nan mikvah shenimdad v'nimsa chaser kol taharu shenasol gabav lemafreya ben b'rshus hayachid ben b'rshus harabim temeos. So a guy had checked the mikvah 2 weeks ago, and he noticed that the mikvah was kosher. It had 40 it was up to the line in the mikvah, right? And then he toiveled a lot of stuff, and this stuff that he toiveled were utensils in the mikvah. And he uses these kalim for taharos, for holy food, under the assumption that the kalim are tahor. Today he goes and he checks the mikvah, and the mikvah is deficient. It's less than 40 saz. And he hadn't measured the mikvah since the last time. So the question now is, what's the status of those kalim that he toiveled in the mikvah? So the Chachamim say, who argue with Rebbe Lazar, every single kli that you toiveled, since the last time you checked that it had 40 saz, is under the assumption that it was toiveled in a pasula mikvah, in a non-kosher mikvah, and therefore any food, any holy food that came in contact with those kalim are considered to be tamei. And it doesn't make a difference whether this safek is raised in a reshus hayachid or whether it's raised in a reshus harabim. So the Gemara, Rashi tells us something very interesting. Normally we say safek tuma b'reshus harabim sfeiko tahor. Normally we say that when you have a safek as to whether something became tamei or not, and the safek is raised in reshus harabim, we assume that the object is tahor. But Rashi says this is different. We know that the kli was tamei, and we don't know whether it was alleviated of its tumah. And in that situation, not when there's a question of did something become tamei or not, then we can say that we can be mekel in reshus harabim. But when we know for sure that something was tamei, and now we're not sure if it was alleviated of its tumah, there it makes no difference whether it's in reshus hayachid or reshus harabim. We always have to be machmir.
In a situation with the rabbanim, would you say lakula, or does it matter?
A safek tumah de rabbanim. That's a very good question. Ayin shev shemaitza. That's a shaila for that sefer that I just referenced, where he goes through all the different permutations. A lot of it depends on whether do we say that safek. First of all, the question is, when we say safek deoraisa l'chumra, is that derabbanan or deoraisa? That in itself is a shaila. So therefore, that would affect whether the din of safek derabbanan l'kula we can be mekel on safek tumah. Okay. Anyway, so the Gemara says pshita de chalukin. So the Gemara says, well, obviously, this disagrees with what Rebbe Lazar ben Shamua said. Why do you need the Gemara to make that observation? So the Gemara says, Mahu detema ma'ila mafreya me'es la'es kamash malon. I'll tell you why. Because you might have looked at that brayse and said, when the Chachamim say you have to be machmer in all the kelim you toivel since the last time you checked, maybe that only means in the last 24 hours, right? Like we had said before. Maybe that's what it means. And therefore it's not an argument with Rebbe Lazar of our Mishnah. So Kamash Malan, no. They mean to say that any kli that you toiveled on any time after the last time you checked that it was kosher is tamei. Let's go weiter. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Begimel Prakim Chule. Rabbi Yehuda says that there's this issue of the east wind after Sukkot that could potentially be damaging to the wine. And therefore you have to check at the time right after Sukkot is over to make sure that the east wind did not damage the wine. So Tana Bekidam Shel Matzoya Chag Shel Tekufa. So the Brisa qualifies that, and it says you have to make sure that you check the wine after Sukkot, but provided that the end of Sukkot happens after the fall equinox, which is called Tekufas Tishrei. And the reason is because I guess before then, if you checked it, that's not a guarantee that the eastern wind, which is very hot, is not going to continue damaging the wine after that. So as long as Sukkot ends after September 21st or whatever approximate date the Tekufas Tishrei is, then as long as you check it at that point and it's still the wine is still good, you can assume it's going to stay good until throughout the winter. So Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer begimel prokim mochrin esatvua lifnei hazera uvishas hazera uvipros pesach. So now we have a brisa that says Rabbi Yehuda says that there are 3 times in the year that you're allowed to sell grain. Now that sounds really bizarre because if I own grain, I can sell it whenever I want. So the Gemara will explain what he's talking about. But there are 3 times a year where you can sell grain: before the planting, at the time of planting, and 2 weeks before Pesach. Now, he also says, Uvishlosha prokrim mochrin es hayayin. There are 3 times in the year that you can sell wine: Vipros ha-Pesach, uvipros atzeres, uvipros ha-Chag. And this is 2 weeks before Pesach, 2 weeks before Shavuos, and 2 weeks before Sukkot. And when it comes to Shemen, V'Shemen, he says, Me atzeres ve'elach, you can sell it any time after Shavuos. Now, Lamai hilchasa. Now, why are you telling me this? A person can sell his produce whenever he wants. What are you saying? So, Amar Rav Avitema Rav Papa L'Shutfin. It has to do with a partnership. If, let's say, I own a produce farm together with a partner, that's when these dates are relevant, because these are the dates when the selling price of these commodities is highest. Okay, these 3 times of the year for grain, for wine, and for oil. Rabbi Yehuda lists the times when you can get the best price. So if, let's say, normally if the stuff belongs to me, I can choose on my own to sell it whenever I want. And if I want to sell it at a time when the price is not high, it's my prerogative. But if I have a partner, let's say I haven't consulted with my partner, he's on a business trip. At what point do I have a right to make an independent decision to sell the produce in the warehouse on behalf of my partner? So the Brisa says that's why it's never good to have partners. You always got to check, right? Right, Moshe? Right. So that's why it says over here, these times of the year for these commodities, you don't even have to check with your partner. You can sell it because there's an assumption that this is the accepted norm in the industry that these are the right times to sell. Okay, so now mikan va'elach mai. So now the question is, okay, what if those times elapse and it's later in the season for wine or for grain? Does a partner have a right to sell? So Amar Rava kol yoma pirkehu. So Rava says every day is its time. Now, what does that mean? Every day is its time. There are 2 ways to understand it, but the Meiri, interestingly enough, understands it as follows: you cannot sell it without the consent of your partner, because he could say, you should have waited till tomorrow, because tomorrow is a better day. Whereas every day could be argued as the optimal day. So therefore, you have to consult with your partner if you want to sell it outside of these times, even if it's later in the season. Okay? So let's go on to some Agadata. Vayehi kizroach hashemesh vayeman elokim ruach kadim charishis. You know the story of Yonah. We read it every Yom Kippur. That towards the end of the story, after he gets spit out by the fish, Hashem lets him go to the outskirts of Nineveh, and when the sun arose, Hashem prepares this eastern wind that is charishis. Now we know the context of the story is that Yonah got very hot. He was he felt very yucky. He felt very oppressed by the hot sun, and Hashem prepared for him a kikayon plant to provide him with shade. But the word charishis, an eastern wind that was charishis, what does that word charishis mean? My charishis. Amar Rav Yehuda, b'shashem in hasheves osa tlamim bayam. So Rav Yehuda says it's implying that it was a very strong gale, gusty wind. And so much so, the reason it's called charishis from the word charisha, plowing, that it created waves in the water, right? So that the waves in the water look like furrows in a plowed field. That's the image of the word charishis. So Amar le Rabbi ihachi hainu dirsiv vatach hashemesh al rosh Yonah vayis alaf ? He says, but that's contextually doesn't make sense. What's the import of the fact that it was a high gale wind? The import of the pasuk is that it was a wind that was so hot that it caused Yonah to fall into a faint, right? So therefore, you have to explain that the word charishis fits into that context. So Ela Amar Rabba B'Shah Shemin Hasheves Mishasekes Kol Aruchos Mipaneha. But rather, Rabba says the word charishis doesn't come from the word plowing, but comes from the word cheresh, which means to be mute. That this wind was so powerful in its heat, in its intense heat, that it silenced all the other winds from other directions that would normally provide coolness and more temperate conditions. So Vahainu Dichsiv, and that's why the pasuk in Eov says, Asher bigadecha chamim bahashkeit eretz midarom. That's why it says that your clothes are hot with the silencing of the earth from the south. And Amar of Tachlif bar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Chisda, Emasai bigadecha chamim b'shah shehishkit eretz midarom shebishah shemenasheves mishasekes kol aruchos mipaneha. Now there are two ways to learn it. I'm going to learn like Rashi, even though I have a shtickle kasha on Rashi, but we'll learn like Rashi that what it means is as follows: that the eastern wind is so intense that even when a more temperate wind is blowing from the south, nevertheless the eastern wind will shut it down and will not allow it to provide any comfort through its blowing, but rather the eastern wind overpowers even the winds that come from the south. That's the way you will understand the pasuk. Rav Huna v'Rav Chisda havu yasvi. Now we're going to learn a story now, and I'm going to tell you my take on the story, even though I haven't seen anyone say this, but I think this is the taich of what the story is referring to. Rav Huna and Rav Chisda were sitting with each other. Chalef ha'azil geniva alayu. There was a man whose name was Geniva. He was one of the sages, and he was walking by them. Now normally, Derech Eretz says that when a Talmud Chacham walks past you, you stand up. No, even if you're in the midst of your learning, unless you're so immersed in your learning that you're not even aware of what's going on. So Omer Chad Lechavre Neko Mikamei Debar Uryanu. So one of the rabbis said to his friend, he says, you know what, we should stand up. This fellow is a paisek. We should show him Derech Eretz. So Amar Le Idach Mikmei Palga'a Nekom. So the other one said, no, this guy's a Bal Machloikes. He argued with Mar Ukva. The Gemara, Rashi brings a story that we saw in the first parak that Geniva had challenged Mar Ukva, who was the Av Beistin, and they said, no, he challenged the Av Beistin. How dare he do such a thing? So therefore, why should he's a Bal Machloikes? Why should we stand up for him? So Amar Le Idach Mikmi. So Adahachi Asa Ihu Lagabayu. While they're schmoozing, deliberating whether to stand up or not, so Geniva walks by them. So Amar Lahu b'mayaskisu. So he said, he sees that they're not standing up, so he gave them the benefit of the doubt. He assumed that they were so immersed in their learning that that's why they didn't stand up. So he says, so Taka Rabbi say, what are you learning? Amrulei beruchos. So they said back to him, we're studying the laws of wind. We're engaged in this discussion of eastern winds, southern winds, things like that. So my understanding of this story is that this was a bit of a shtach. In other words, what they were basically telling him is that you're full of hot air, and that's why you challenged the Av Beistin because you're so high and mighty. That was your wind that you blew, right? So Amar Lahu Hachi Amar Rav Chanan Bar Rava Amar Rav Dalad Ruchos Menashvos B'chol Yom V'Ruach Tzafonis Menashevesim Kulan She'il Molei Kain Ein Ha'olam Miskayim Afilu Shah Echas. The Ruach Deromis Kasha Mikulan. So he says, oh well, if you're studying the laws of wind, let me tell you an interesting halacha. Rav was quoted as saying that there are four winds that blow from all four directions. The northern wind always blows together with all the other winds because it is the most temperate of winds, and it sort of tempers the drastic temperatures that come from the other winds, from the directions, because without that northern wind, the world could not endure even for one moment. The Ruach Deromis Kasha Mikulan, and the southern wind is the harshest. And if it were not for the angel, whose name is Ben Nates, who has wings that he can flap to withstand the blowing of the southern wind would destroy the whole world. Now you notice it's a little bit schwer, because before we were talking about the eastern wind, now we're talking about the southern wind. So I guess you have to say, I think this is the way Rashi learns, is that the southern wind is not as intense because of this angel Ben Nates. And that's why we have to worry more about the eastern wind, because the eastern wind does not have an angel holding it back. But the point is that I think that perhaps even Geniva himself was cognizant of that this was a shtickle shtach. And instead of starting a fight with them, he wanted to tell them, sometimes you need a ruach tzafonis, you need a wind blowing from the north to create a temperate climate, because sometimes you have the rabbis that come from the south that are hot-tempered, and they're going to create piskei halacha that are unreasonable. You sometimes need to temper that with a northern wind that comes from another direction and offers a different perspective. So that's one of the ways that's what he was trying to explain to them. Shenemar, and this is what the pasuk in Eov says. Hamibinascha ya'avir nates yifros kenafav l'seiman. He says that's from your understanding. The wings of nates will spread out its wings and will hold back the hot air that's coming from Taiman, that's coming from Yemen, from the south. Let's look at another story. Rav Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak havu Yasvi habachalef va'azl Rav Nachman, or actually the other girsos have habachalef va'azl Rav Acha bar Yaakov the Yosef beguharka de Dahava uParasalei Sarbala de Karti. So these two rabbis, Rava and Rav Nachman, were sitting and learning. All of a sudden, they see this opulent golden carriage that's covered with a purple velvet or something like that. It's really, really a sign of great wealth. And it was carrying Rav Acha bar Yaakov inside the carriage. So Rava azal legabe, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lo azal legabe. So Rava says, you know what? Show some derech eretz to a wealthy person. So he goes to greet the carriage, and he goes to greet Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Nachman says, I don't need to go, because Amar Dilma mi inshe devei reish galusin inhu Rav tzarach lahu ana lo tzrichna lahu. So Rav Nachman says, you know what? I already got connections with the government. If this guy is maybe a government official, and that's why he's on the take from the government, and that's why he's got this golden carriage, it's okay. I don't need any favors from anybody, and therefore I don't need to go and greet this fellow. So Kidechazer de Rav Acha bar Yaakov Hava Azul Legabe. When he saw that it was Rav Acha bar Yaakov, then Rav Nachman decided, you know what, I'll go over to him anyway. But again, here there's maybe a subliminal shtach that Rav Nachman wants to give to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, perhaps accusing him of, garnering favors from the government when others are at a disadvantage. So Goli Ladare, Amar Shad Yanoshiv. So he rolls up his sleeve by lifting up his arm and letting his sleeve roll down. And then he says, oh my goodness, Shad Yanoshiv. The hot wind is blowing. It's really warm in here, in this area. And I think, again, this is a subliminal, or perhaps not so subliminal, a bit of a shtach to Rav Acha bar Yaakov saying, oh, there's hot air here. And that's why it's really hot over here. Meaning that he was trying to explain to him that he's a bit critical of someone who exploits the favors of the government for personal gain to be able to ride out in a golden carriage. So, Amar Rava, Hachi Amar Rav, Isha Mapeles Bo. So Rava, hearing this, says that, this wind is so hot. In other words, the wind from the east is such a dangerous and toxic wind that it could cause a woman to miscarry. Ushmuel Amar Afilu Margolis Shabayam Mirakeves Bo, and Shmuel says it could even cause the pearls beneath the ocean to become rotten. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar Afilu Shichva Zera Shabimei Isha Masrachas Bo, and Rabbi Yochanan says that even semen that has not yet fertilized the egg in a woman's womb could become putrid because of the eastern wind. And so Rav Acha bar Yaakov hears this, or I think that's the girsa that they say Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Amar Rav Nachman Ushlash the Mikra Echa Darshu. Rav Nachman says that they all derive this from the same pasuk. The pasuk in Hosea says, Kihu bein achim yafri, that this wind will flourish amongst its brethren. Yavo kadim ruach Hashem midbar oleh, that an eastern wind will come from the desert. V'yevosh mikaro, it will dry out the source. V'yecherav mayano, and it'll make arid the wellspring. Hu yishseh otzar kol kalichemda, and it will spoil the treasures of even the most desirable treasures. So he says like this: Yevosh mikaro zu mikara shel isha. That when it says it'll dry out the source, this is referring to an eastern wind can cause a woman to miscarry because the source meaning her womb. The yecherav mayano ze shichva zer, it'll dry out or make arid the wellspring. This refers to the semen that's in a woman's womb that will not be able to fertilize. Shebemei isha, and then finally, hu yishseh otzar kol kalichemda, it'll destroy or corrupt even the most desirable treasure, Zem Argola Shabayam. This refers to the pearls that are in the ocean. And I think that, again, this is a bit of a underneath the surface critique of Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, who's relying on the opulence of the Reish Galusa in order to garner personal favor. And what basically they're saying to him is that your exploitation for personal gain is like the eastern wind that comes up and destroys other people's assets. And because you're taking this from the government, it's at other people's expense, and look at all of the things that you've destroyed that belong to other people. Okay, that's really what I believe is the subliminal message that's being imparted to him. And of course, he's going to now respond. So the girsa that I have on the side is Omer Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov responds to them and he says, Eidei sura'ahu dedaike kroi. He says, I have other people from Surah that are good witnesses on how to interpret a pasuk, and they tell me another explanation as to what an eastern wind can do. He says, Mai kihu bein achim yafri. What does the pasuk in Hosea mean when it says that it'll flourish amongst its brethren? Amar Rava afilu sufta bekufina demora rafia. This means that even a handle of an axe or a hoe will become loosened from the eastern wind, because what does an eastern wind do? It dries out everything that has moisture. So a wooden handle that's embedded in an axe, the head of an axe, it'll cause the wood to become so dried out that it'll get loose and it'll fall out of the groove, out of the socket of the axe. And Rav Yosef Amar Afilu Sichta B'Dafna Rafia. Rav Yosef, again, this interpretation from Surah says that even if you have a peg embedded in the wall, the peg will become dried out and will fall out of its socket because it'll become loose because of that eastern wind. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Amar Afilu Kanya B'Kufta Rafia. Even a stick that is woven into a basket will become loose because of the eastern wind. And I believe that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov was responding to these rabbis is that you think I'm full of hot air, and that's why I'm exploiting the Reish Galusa at other people's expense. Let me tell you what hot air does. You guys are full of hot air too. You know what hot air does? It creates things that are normally connected and have achdus with each other. It causes them all to fall apart. So don't tell me that my hot air, maybe because of your own jealousy, is deserving of criticism and contempt. Your hot air is even worse because it causes things, Achdus and Klal Yisrael, to fall to pieces because you're so full of yourselves and feel that you can just criticize anyone who has been able to live a little bit higher than somebody else. Hadron alach kol haget. Have a wonderful day.